Welcome back to A Clock in the Journal. A man returns, but not as himself. The face is altered, the voice measured, everything replaced with care. This is not disguise alone. It is transformation. He steps forward as someone else entirely, and yet something remains beneath it. A trace, a presence that cannot be erased. To those who do not know, he is convincing. To those who do, he is dangerous. Because a mask, once worn too long, does not simply hide the truth, it begins to reshape it. Chapter 1v. Our Mr. Shylock. I have often wondered in what pause or phase of our conversation Raffles hit upon the plan which we duly carried out, for we had been talking incessantly since his arrival about 8 o'clock at night until 2 in the morning. Yet that which we discussed between 2 and 3 was what we actually did between 9 and 10, with the single exception necessitated by an altogether unforeseen development, of which the less said the better until the proper time. The foresight and imagination of a Raffles are obviously apt to outstrip his spoken words. But even in the course of speech, his ideas would crystallize quite palpably to the listener, and the sentence that began by throwing out a shadowy idea would culminate in a definite project, as the image comes into focus under the lens, and with as much detail into the bargain. Suffice it that after a long night of it at the Albany, and but a bath and a cup of tea at my own flat, I found Raffles waiting for me in Piccadilly, and down we went together to the jaws of Jermyn Street. There we nodded, and I was proceeding down the hill when I turned on my heel as though I had forgotten something, and entered Jermyn Street not 50 yards behind Raffles. I had no thought of catching him up, but it so happened that I was in his wake, in time to witness a first contretemps which did not amount to much at the time. This was merely the violent exit of another of Dan Levy's early callers into the very arms of Raffles. There was a heated apology, accepted with courteous composure, and followed by an excited outpouring which I did not come near enough to overhear. It was delivered by a little man in an aureole of indigo hair, who brushed his great sombrero violently as he spoke, and Raffles listened. I could see from their manner that the collision which had just occurred was not the subject under discussion, but I failed to distinguish a word, though I listened outside a hatter's until Raffles had gone in and his new acquaintance had passed me with blazing eyes and a volley of husky vows in broken English. Another of Mr. Shylock's victims, thought I, and indeed he might have been bleeding internally from the loss of his pound of flesh. At any rate, there was bloodshed in his eyes. I stood a long time outside that hatter's window, and finally went in to choose a cap. But the light is wicked in those narrow shops, and this necessitated my carrying several caps to the broad daylight of the threshold to gauge their shades, and incidentally to achieve a swift survey of the street. Then they crowned me with an ingenious apparatus, like a typewriter, to get the exact shape and measure of my skull, for I had intimated that I had no desire to dress it anywhere else for the future. All this must have taken up the most of 20 minutes, yet after getting as far as Mr. Shylock's, I remembered that I required what one's hatter and no one else calls a boater, and back I went to order one in addition to the cap. And as the next tack fetches the buoy, so my next perambulation, in which, however, I was thinking seriously of a new bowler, brought me face to face with Raffles once more. We shouted and shook hands. Our encounter had taken place almost under the money-lender's windows, and it was so un-English in its cordiality that between our slaps and grasps, Raffles managed deftly to insert a stout packet in my breast pocket. I cannot think the most critical pedestrian could have seen it done. But streets have as many eyes as Argus, and some of them are always on one. They had to send to the bank for it, whispered Raffles. It barely passed through their hands. But don't you let Shylock spot his own envelope. In another second, he was saying something very different that anybody might have heard, and in yet another, he was hustling me across Shylock's threshold. "I'll take you up and introduce you," he cried aloud. "You couldn't come to a better man, my dear fellow. He's the only honest one in Europe. Is Mr. Levy disengaged?" A stunted young gentleman who spoke as though he had a hare lip or was in liquor neither calamity having really befallen him, said that he thought so, but would see, which he proceeded to do through a telephone, after shifting the indicator from through to private. He slid off his stool at once, and another youth of similar appearance and still more similar peculiarity of speech, who entered in a hurry at that moment, was told to hold on while he showed the gentleman upstairs. There were other clerks behind the mahogany bulwark, and we heard the newcomer greeting them hoarsely as we climbed up into the presence. Dan Levy, as I must try to call him when Raffles is not varnishing my tale, looked a very big man at his enormous desk, but by no means so elephantine as at the tiny table in the Savoy restaurant a month earlier. His privations had not only reduced his bulk to the naked eye, but made him look 10 years younger. He wore the habiliments of a gentleman. Even as he sat at his desk, his well-cut coat and well-tied tie filled me with that inconsequent respect which the silk pajamas had engendered in Raffles. But the great face that greeted us with a shrewd and rather scornful geniality impressed me yet more powerfully. In its massive features and its craggy contour, it displayed the frank pugnacity of the pugilist rather than the low cunning of the traditional usurer, and the nose in particular, while of far healthier appearance than when I had seen it first and last, was both dominant and menacing in its immensity. It was a comfort to turn from this formidable countenance to that of Raffles, who had entered with his own serene, unconscious confidence, and now introduced us with that inimitable air of light-hearted authority which stamped him in all shades of society. "Happy to meet you, sir. I hope you're well," said Mr. Levy, dropping one aspirate but putting in the next with care. "Take a seat, sir, please." But I kept my legs, though I felt them near to trembling, and, diving a hand into a breast pocket, I began working the contents out of the envelope that Raffles had given me, while I spoke out in a tone sufficiently rehearsed at the Albany overnight. "I'm not so sure about the happiness," said I. "I mean, about its lasting, Mr. Levy. I come from my friend, Mr. Edward Garland." "I thought you came to borrow money," interposed Raffles with much indignation. The moneylender was watching me with bright eyes and lips I could no longer see. "I never said so," I rapped out at Raffles, and I thought I saw approval and encouragement behind his stare-like truth at the bottom of the well. "Who's the little biter?" the moneylender inquired of him with delightful insolence. "An old friend of mine," replied Raffles, in an injured tone that made a convincing end of the old friendship. "I thought he was hard up, or I never should have brought him in to introduce to you." "I didn't ask you for your introduction, Raffles," said I offensively. "I simply met you coming out as I was coming in. I thought you damned officious if you ask me." Whereupon, with an Anglo-Saxon threat of subsequent violence to my person, Raffles flung open the door to leave us to our interview. This was exactly as it had been rehearsed, but Dan Levy called Raffles back. And that was exactly as we had hoped. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," said the Jew, "please don't make a cockpit of my office, gentlemen, and pray, Mr. Raffles, don't leave me to the mercies of your very dangerous friend." "You can be 2-to-1 if you like," I gasped valiantly. "I don't care." And my chest heaved in accordance with my stage instructions, as also with a realism to which it was a relief to give full play. "Come now," said Levy. "What did Mr. Garland send you about?" "You know well enough," said I. "His debt to you." "Don't be rude about it," said Levy. "What about the debt?" "It's a damn disgrace," said I. "I quite agree," he chuckled. "It ought to. Avenue been settled months ago." "Months ago?" I echoed. "It's only 12 months since he borrowed £300 from you, and now you're sticking him for 7. "I am," said Levy, opening uncompromising lips that entirely disappeared again next instant. "He borrows 300 for a year at the outside, and you blackmail him for 800 when the year's up." "You said 7 just now," interrupted Raffles, but in the voice of a man who was getting a fright. "You also said blackmailing," added Dan Levy portentously. "Do you want to be thrown downstairs?" "Do you deny the figures?" I retorted. "No, I don't. Have you got his repayment cards?" "Yes," here in my hands, and they shan't leave them. You see, you're not aware," I added severely, as I turned to Raffles, "that this young fellow has already paid up 100 in installments. That's what makes the 8. And all this is what'll happen to you if you've been fool enough to get into the same boat." The moneylender had borne with me longer than either of us had expected that he would. But now he wheeled back his chair and stood up, a pillar of peril and a mouthful of oaths. "Is that all you've come to say?" he thundered. "If so, you young devil, out you go." "No, it isn't," said I, spreading out a document attached to the cards of receipt which Raffles had obtained from Teddy Garland. These I had managed to extract without anything else from the inner pocket in which I had been trying to empty out Raffles's envelope. "Here," I continued, "is a letter written only yesterday by you to Mr. Garland, in which you say, among other very insolent things, 'This is final, and absolutely no excuses of any kind will be tolerated or accepted. You have given 10 times more trouble than your custom is worth, and I shall be glad to get rid of you. So you had better pay up before 12 o'clock tomorrow, as you may depend that the above threats will be carried out to the very letter, and steps will be taken to carry them into effect at that hour. This is your dead and last chance, and the last time I will write you on the subject.'" "So it is," said Levy with an oath. "This is a very bad case, Mr. Raffles." "I agree," said I. "And may I ask if you propose to get rid of Mr. Garland by making him pay up in full?" "Before 12 o'clock today," said Dan Levy with a snap of his prize-fighting jaws. "800? First and last for the 300 he borrowed a year ago?" "That's it. Surely that's very hard on the boy," I said, reaching the conciliatory stage by degrees on which Raffles paid me many compliments later. But at the time he remarked, "I should say it was his own fault." "Of course it is, Mr. Raffles," cried the moneylender, taking a more conciliatory tone himself. "It was my money. It was my 300 golden sovereigns, and you can sell what's yours for what it'll fetch, can't you?" "Obviously," said Raffles. "Very well then, money's like anything else. If you haven't got it and can't beg or earn it, you've got to buy it at a price. I sell my money, that's all. And I've a right to sell it at a fancy price if I can get a fancy price for it. A man may be a fool to pay my figure. That depends. How much he wants the money at the time, and it's his affair, not mine. Your gay young friend was all right if he hadn't defaulted. But a defaulter deserves to pay through the nose, and be damned to him. It wasn't me let your friend in. He let in himself with his eyes open. Mr. Garland knew very well what I was charging him, and what I shouldn't hesitate to charge over and above if he gave me half a chance. Why should I? Wasn't it in the bond? What do you all think I run my show for? It's business, Mr. Raffles, not robbery, my dear sir. All business is robbery, if you come to that. But you'll find mine is all above board and in the bond." "A very admirable exposition," said Raffles weightily. "Not that it applies to you, Mr. Raffles." The other was adroit enough to add, "Mr. Garland was no friend of mine, and he was a fool, whereas I hope I may say that you're the one and not the other." "Then it comes to this," said I, "that you mean him to pay up in full this morning?" "By noon, and it's just gone 10. The whole £700? Sterling," said Mr. Levy. "No checks entertained." "Then," said I with an air of final defeat, "there's nothing for it but to follow my instructions and pay you now on the nail." I did not look at Levy, but I heard the sudden intake of his breath at the sight of my banknotes, and I felt its baleful exhalation on my forehead as I stooped and began counting them out upon his desk. I had made some progress before he addressed me in terms of protest. There was almost a tremor in his voice. I had no call to be so hasty. It looked as though I had been playing a game with him. Why couldn't I tell him I had the money with me all the time? The question was asked with a sudden oath, because I had gone on counting it out regardless of his overtures. I took as little notice of his anger. "And now, Mr. Levy," I concluded, "may I ask you to return me Mr. Garland's promissory note?" "Yes, you may ask and you shall receive," he snarled, and opened his safe so violently that the keys fell out. Raffles replaced them with exemplary promptitude while the note of hand was being found. The evil little document was in my possession at last, Levy roared down the tube, and the young man of the imperfect diction duly appeared. "Take that young biter," cried Levy, "and throw him into the street. Call up Moses to lend you a and—" But the first murderer stood nonplussed, looking from Raffles to me, and finally inquiring which biter his master meant. "That one," bellowed the moneylender, shaking a lethal fist at me. "Mister, Raffles is a friend o' mine." "But eth a friend of CITJ too," lisped the young man. "Thimion Markth come across the THT reet to tell me though. He thought them they can outhide our plave after he'd then arm in arm in Piccadilly, and he come into they though in Cath." But the youth of limited articulation was not allowed to finish his explanation. He was grasped by the scruff of the neck and kicked and shaken out of the room, and his collar flung after him. I heard him blubbering on the stairs as Levy locked the door and put the key in his pocket. But I did not hear Raffles slip into the swivel chair behind the desk, or know that he had done so until the usurer and I turned round together. "Out of that!" blustered Levy, but Raffles tilted the chair back on its spring and laughed softly in his face. "Not if I know it," said he. "If you don't open the door in about 1 minute, I shall require this telephone of yours to ring up the police." "The police, eh?" said Levy with a sinister recovery of self-control. "You'd better leave that to me, you precious pair of swindlers." "Besides," continued Raffles, "of course you keep an argumentum ad hominem in one of these drawers. Ah, here it is, and just as well in my hands as in yours." He had opened the top drawer in the right-hand pedestal and taken therefrom a big bulldog revolver. It was the work of few moments to empty its 5 chambers and hand the pistol by its barrel to the owner. "Curse you!" hissed the latter, hurling it into the fender with a fearful clatter. "But you'll pay for this, my fine gentleman. This isn't sharp practice, but criminal fraud." "The burden of proof," said Raffles, "lies with you. Meanwhile, will you be good enough to open that door instead of looking as sick as a cold mud poultice?" The moneylender had, indeed, turned as gray as his hair, and his eyebrows, which were black and looked dyed, stood out like smears of ink. Nevertheless, the simile which Raffles had employed with his own unfortunate facility was more picturesque than discreet. I saw it set Mr. Shylock thinking. Luckily, the evil of the day was sufficient for it and him. But so far from complying, he set his back to the locked door and swore a sweet oath never to budge. "Oh, very well," resumed Raffles, and the receiver was at his ear without more ado. "Is that the exchange? Give me 9233, Gerard, will you?" "It's fraud," reiterated Levy, "and you know it." "It's nothing of the sort, and you know it," murmured Raffles, with the proper preoccupation of the man at the telephone. "You lent the money," I added. "That's your business. It's nothing to do with you what he chooses to do with it." "He's a cursed swindler," hissed Levy, "and you're his damn decoy." I was not sorry to see Raffles's face light up across the desk. "Is that Howson, Anstruther, and Martin? They're only my solicitors, Mr. Levy." "Put me through to Mr. Martin, please." "That you, Charlie? You might come in a cab to Jermyn Street. I forget the number. Dan Levy's, the money-lenders. Thanks, old chap. Wait a bit, Charlie. A constable." But Dan Levy had unlocked his door and flung it open. "There you are, you scoundrels. But we'll meet again, my fine, swell mobsman." Raffles was frowning at the telephone. "I've been cut off," said he. "Wait a bit. Clear call for you, Mr. Levy, I believe." And they changed places, without exchanging another word until Raffles and I were on the stairs. "Why, the phone's not even through!" yelled the moneylender, rushing out. "But we are, Mr. Levy!" cried Raffles, and down we ran into the street. Chapter 5. Thin Air. Raffles hailed a passing hansom and had bundled me in before I realized that he was not coming with me. "Drive down to the club for Teddy's cricket bag," said he. "We'll make him get straight into flannels to save time. Order breakfast for 3 in half an hour precisely, and I'll tell him everything before you're back." His eyes were shining with the prospect as I drove away. not sorry to escape the scene of that young man's awakening to better fortune than he deserved. For in my heart I could not quite forgive the act in which Raffles and I had caught him overnight. Raffles might make as light of it as he pleased. It was impossible for another to take his affectionately lenient view, not of the moral question involved, but of the breach of faith between friend and friend. My own feeling in the matter, however, if a little jaundiced, was not so strong as to prevent me from gloating over the victory in which I had just assisted. I thought of the notorious extortioner who had fallen to our unscrupulous but not indictable wiles, and my heart tinkled with the hansom bell. I thought of the good that we had done for once, of the undoubted wrong we had contrived to right by a species of justifiable chicanery, and I forgot all about the youth whose battle we had fought and won, until I found myself ordering his breakfast and having his cricket bag taken out to my cab. Raffles was waiting for me in the Albany courtyard. I thought he was frowning at the sky, which was not what it had been earlier in the morning, until I remembered how little time there was to lose. "Haven't you seen anything of him?" he cried as I jumped out. "Of whom, Raffles?" "Teddy, of course." "Teddy Garland? Has he gone out?" "Before I got in," said Raffles grimly. "I wonder where the devil he is." He had paid the cabman and taken down the bag himself. I followed him up to his rooms. "But what's the meaning of it, Raffles?" "That's what I want to know." "Could he have gone out for a paper?" "They were all here before I went. I left them on his bed." "Or for a shave?" "That's more likely, but he's been out nearly an hour." "But you can't have been gone much longer yourself, Raffles, and I understood you left him fast asleep?" "That's the worst of it, Bunny. He must have been shamming. Barraclough saw him go out 10 minutes after me." "Could you have disturbed him when you went?" Raffles shook his head. "I never shut a door more carefully in my life. I made row enough when I came back, Bunny, on purpose to wake him up, and I can tell you it gave me a turn when there wasn't a sound from in there. He'd shut all the doors after him. It was a second or two before I had the pluck to open them. I thought something horrible had happened." "You don't think so still?" "I don't know what to think," said Raffles gloomily. "Nothing has panned out as I thought it would. You must remember that we have given ourselves away to Dan Levy, whatever else we have done, and without doubt set up the enemy of our lives in the very next street. It's close quarters, Bunny. We shall have an expert eye upon us for some time to come, but I should rather enjoy that than otherwise, if only Teddy hadn't bolted in this rotten way." Never had I known Raffles in so pessimistic a mood. I did not share his somber view of either matter, though I confined my remarks to the one that seemed to weigh most heavily on his mind. "A guinea to a gooseberry," I wagered, "that you find your man safe and sound at Lord's." "I rang them up 10 minutes ago," said Raffles. "They hadn't heard of him then. Besides, here's his cricket bag. He may have been at the club when I fetched it away. I never asked." "I did, Bunny. I rang them up as well, just after you had left." "Then what about his father's house?" "That's our one chance," said Raffles. "They're not on the telephone, but now that you're here, I've a good mind to drive out and see if Teddy's there. You know what a state he was in last night, and you know how a thing can seem worse when you wake and remember it than it did at the time it happened. I begin to hope he's gone straight to old Garland with the whole story. In that case, he's bound to come back for his kit, and by Jove, Bunny, there's a step upon the stairs." We had left the doors open behind us, and a step it was, ascending hastily enough to our floor, but it was not the step of a very young man, and Raffles was the first to recognize the fact. His face fell as we looked at each other for a single moment of suspense. In another, he was out of the room, and I heard him greeting Mr. Garland on the landing. "Then you haven't brought Teddy with you?" I heard Raffles add. "Do you mean to say he isn't here?" replied so pleasant a voice, in accents of such acute dismay, that Mr. Garland had my sympathy before we met. "He has been," said Raffles, "and I'm expecting him back every minute. Won't you come in and wait, Mr. Garland?" The pleasant voice made an exclamation of premature relief. The pair entered, and I was introduced to the last person I should have suspected of being a retired brewer at all, much less of squandering his money in retirement as suggested by his son. I was prepared for a conventional embodiment of reckless prosperity, for a pseudo-military type in louder purple and finer linen than the real thing. I shook hands instead with a gentle, elderly man, whose kindly eyes beamed bravely amid careworn furrows, and whose slightly diffident yet wholly cordial address won my heart outright. "So you've lost no time in welcoming the wanderer," said he. "You're nearly as bad as my boy, who was quite bent on seeing Raffles last night or first thing this morning. He told me he should stay the night in town if necessary, and he evidently has." There was still a trace of anxiety in the father's manner, but there was also a twinkle in his eyes, which kindled with genial fires as Raffles gave a perfectly truthful account of the young man's movements, as distinct from his words and deeds, overnight. "And what do you think of his great news?" asked Mr. Garland. "Was it a surprise to you, Raffles?" Raffles shook his head with a rather weary smile, and I sat up in my chair. What great news was this? "This son of mine has just got engaged," explained Mr. Garland for my benefit. "And as a matter of fact, it's his engagement that brings me here. You gentlemen mustn't think I want to keep an eagle eye upon him, but Miss Belsize has just wired to say she is coming up early to go with us to the match, instead of meeting at Lord's, and I thought she would be so disappointed not to find Teddy, especially as they are bound to see very little of each other all day." I, for my part, was wondering why I had not heard of Miss Belsize or this engagement from Raffles. He must himself have heard of it last thing at night in the next room, while I was star-gazing here at the open window. Yet in all the small hours, he had never told me of a circumstance which extenuated young Garland's conduct, if it did nothing else. Even now it was not from Raffles that I received either word or look of explanation, but his face had suddenly lit up. "May I ask," he exclaimed, "if the telegram was to Teddy, or to you, Mr. Garland?" "It was addressed to Teddy, but, of course, I opened it in his absence." "Could it have been an answer to an invitation or suggestion of his?" "Very easily. They had lunch together yesterday, and Camilla might have had to consult Lady Laura." "Then that's the whole thing!" cried Raffles. "Teddy was on his way home while you were on yours into town. How did you come?" "In the brougham." "Through the park?" "Yes. While he was in a hansom in Knightsbridge, or Kensington Gore. That's how you missed him," said Raffles confidently. "If you drive straight back, you'll be in time to take him on to Lord's." Mr. Garland begged us both to drive back with him, and we thought we might. We decided that we would, and were all three underway in about a minute. Yet it was considerably after 11 when we bowled through Kensington to a house that I had never seen before, a house since swept away by the flowing tide of flats. But I can still see every stone and slate of it, as clearly as on that summer morning more than 10 years ago. It stood just off the thoroughfare, in grounds of its own, out of all keeping with their metropolitan environment. They ran from one side street to another, and further back than we could see. Vivid lawn and towering tree, brilliant beds and crystal vineries, struck one more forcibly and favorably than the mullioned and turreted mansion of a house. And yet a double stream of omnibuses rattled incessantly within a few yards of the steps on which the three of us soon stood nonplussed. Mr. Edward had not been seen or heard of at the house, neither had Miss Belsize arrived. That was the one consolatory feature. "Come into the library," said Mr. Garland, and when we were among his books, which were somewhat beautifully bound and cased in glass, he turned to Raffles and added hoarsely, "There's something in all this I haven't been told, and I insist on knowing what it is." "But you know as much as I do," protested Raffles. "I went out leaving Teddy asleep and came back to find him flown." "What time was that?" "Between 9 and past when I went out. I was away nearly an hour. Why leave him asleep at that time of morning?" "I wanted him to have every minute he could get. We had been sitting up rather late." "But why, Raffles? What could you have to talk about all night when you were tired, and it was Teddy's business to keep fresh for today? Why, after all, should he want to see you the moment you got back? He's not the first young fellow who's got rather suddenly engaged to a charming girl. Is he in any trouble about it, Raffles?" "About his engagement? Not that I'm aware. Then he is in some trouble." "He was, Mr. Garland," answered Raffles. "I give you my word that he isn't now." Mr. Garland grasped the back of a chair. "Was it some money trouble, Raffles?" "Of course. If my boy has given you his confidence, I have no right simply as his father." "It is hardly that, sir," said Raffles gently. "It is I who have no right to give him away. But if you don't mind leaving it at that, Mr. Garland, there is perhaps no harm in my saying that it was about some little temporary embarrassment that Teddy was so anxious to see me." "And you helped him?" cried the poor man, plainly torn between gratitude and humiliation. "Not out of my pocket," replied Raffles, smiling. The matter was not so serious as Teddy thought. It only required adjustment. "God bless you, Raffles," murmured Mr. Garland with a catch in his voice. "I won't ask for a single detail. My poor boy went to the right man. He knew better than to come to me. Like father, like son," he muttered to himself, and dropped into the chair he had been handling, and bent his head over his folded arms. He seemed to have forgotten the untoward effect of Teddy's disappearance and the peculiar humiliation of its first cause. Raffles took out his watch and held up the dial for me to see. It was after the half-hour now, but at this moment a servant entered with a missive, and the master recovered his self-control. "This'll be from Teddy," he cried, fumbling with his glasses. "No, it's for him, and by special messenger. I'd better open it. I don't suppose it's Miss Belsize again." "Miss Belsize is in the drawing-room, sir," said the man. "She said you were not to be disturbed." "Oh, tell her we shan't be long," said Mr. Garland, with a new strain of trouble in his tone. "Listen to this. Listen to this," he went on before the door was shut. "What has happened? Lost toss. Whipham plays if you don't turn up in time. J. S." "Jack Studley," said Raffles, "the Cambridge skipper." I know. And Whipham's reserve man, isn't he?" "And another wicket-keeper. Worse luck," exclaimed Raffles. "If he turns out and takes a single ball, and Teddy is only 1 over late, it will still be too late for him to play." "Then it's too late already," said Mr. Garland, sinking back into his chair with a groan. "But that note from Studley may have been half an hour on the way." "No, Raffles, it's not an ordinary note. It's a message telephoned straight from Lord's, probably within the last few minutes, to a messenger office not 100 yards from this door." Mr. Garland sat staring miserably at the carpet. He was beginning to look ill with perplexity and suspense. Raffles himself, who had turned his back upon us with a shrug of acquiescence in the inevitable, was a monument of discomfiture as he stood gazing through a glass door into the adjoining conservatory. There was no actual window in the library, but this door was a single sheet of plate glass into which a man might well have walked, and I can still see Raffles in full-length silhouette upon a panel of palms and tree ferns. I see the silhouette grow tall and straight again before my eyes, the door open, and Raffles listening with an alert lift of the head. I, too, hear something, an elfin hiss, a fairy fusillade, and then the sudden laugh with which Raffles rejoined us in the body of the room. "It's raining," he cried, waving a hand above his head. "Have you a barometer, Mr. Garland? That's an aneroid under the lamp bracket. How often do you set the indicator?" "Last thing every night. I remember it was between fair and change when I went to bed. It made me anxious. It may make you thankful now. It's between change and rain this morning. And the rain's begun, and while there's rain, there's hope." In a twinkling Raffles had regained all his own irresistible buoyancy and assurance, but the older man was not capable of so prompt a recovery. "Something has happened to my boy, but not necessarily anything terrible. If I knew what, Raffles, if only I knew what." Raffles eyed the pale and twitching face with sidelong solicitude. He himself had the confident expression which always gave me confidence. The rattle on the conservatory roof was growing louder every minute. "I intend to find out," said he, "and if the rain goes on long enough, we may still see Teddy playing when it stops. But I shall want your help, sir. I am ready to go with you anywhere, Raffles." "You can only help me, Mr. Garland, by staying where you are, where I am." "In the house all day," said Raffles firmly. "It is absolutely essential to my idea." "And that is, Raffles?" "To save Teddy's face in the first instance. I shall drive straight up to Lord's, in your brougham if I may. I know Studley rather well. He shall keep Teddy's place open till the last possible moment." "But how shall you account for his absence?" I asked. "I shall account for it all right," said Raffles darkly. "I can save his face for the time being, at all events at Lord's." "But that's the only place that matters," said I. "On the contrary, Bunny, this very house matters even more as long as Miss Belsize is here. You forget that they're engaged, and that she's in the next room now." "Good God," whispered Mr. Garland. "I had forgotten that myself." "She is the last who must know of this affair," said Raffles, with, I thought, undue authority. "And you are the only one who can keep it from her, sir." "I? Miss Belsize mustn't go up to Lord's this morning. She would only spoil her things, and you may tell her from me that there would be no play for an hour after this, even if it stopped this minute, which it won't. Meanwhile, let her think that Teddy's weather-bound with the rest of them in the pavilion, but she mustn't come until you hear from me again, and the best way to keep her here is to stay with her yourself." "And when may I expect to hear?" asked Mr. Garland as Raffles held out his hand. "Let me see. I shall be at Lord's in less than 20 minutes. Another 5 or 10 should polish off Studley. And then I shall barricade myself in the telephone box and ring up every hospital in town. You see, it may be an accident after all, though I don't think so. You won't hear from me on the point unless it is. The fewer messengers flying about the better, if you agree with me as to the wisdom of keeping the matter dark at this end." "Oh, yes, I agree with you, Raffles, but it will be a terribly hard task for me." "It will indeed, Mr. Garland. Yet no news is always good news, and I promise to come straight to you the moment I have news of any kind." With that they shook hands, our host with an obvious reluctance that turned to a less understandable dismay as I also prepared to take my leave of him. "What?" cried he. "Am I to be left quite alone to hoodwink that poor girl and hide my own anxiety?" "There's no reason why you should come, Bunny," said Raffles to me. "If either of them is a one-man job, it's mine." Our host said no more, but he looked at me so wistfully that I could not but offer to stay with him if he wished it. And when at length the drawing-room door had closed upon him and his son's fiancée, I took an umbrella from the stand and saw Raffles through the providential downpour into the brougham. "I'm sorry, Bunny," he muttered between the butler in the porch and the coachman on the box. "This sort of thing is neither in my line nor yours, but it serves us right for straying from the path of candid crime. We should have opened a safe for that 700. But what do you really think is at the bottom of this extraordinary disappearance?" "Some madness or other, I'm afraid. But if that boy is still in the land of the living, I shall have him before the sun goes down on his insanity." "And what about this engagement of his?" I pursued. "Do you disapprove of it?" "Why on earth should I?" asked Raffles rather sharply as he plunged from under my umbrella into the brougham. "Because you never told me when he told you," I replied. "Is the girl beneath him?" Raffles looked at me inscrutably with his clear blue eyes. "You'd better find out for yourself," said he. "Tell the coachman to hurry up to Lord's, and pray that this rain may last."